Hello, it's a great pleasure to welcome those of you watching us live now, as well as those of you who will be watching us from Cooperativa's YouTube channel if in future. I'm Maria from Kooperativa, and I'm in charge of moderating this talk today entitled From Bad to Worse Part 2, Independent Culture 3 Years into Pandemic. This conversation, as well as the research which will be discussed today, is happening thanks to the support of Balkan Trust for Democracy, a project of the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the USAID, and it's co-funded by the European Union as a part of the open call for proposals, cultural cooperation projects in the Western Balkans, strengthening cultural cooperation with competitiveness of cultural and creative industries in the Western Balkans. I'm very happy to be virtually accompanied by two speakers, the researchers from the Center for the Empirical Cultural Studies of Southeast Europe, which is based in Niš. So today with me are Višnja Kišić and Goran Tomka, who are here to tell us a bit about the research dealing with the ramifications that COVID-19 pandemic caused for independent culture sector in Southeast Europe, which they had conducted this year in cooperation with Kooperativa. So hello, Višnja and Goran. So I will just start with the questions, which will, I hope, help us all understand better the research which you have conducted this year, but also 2 years ago. And so as just to say that while we were preparing for this talk, for this presentation in the office, we had been discussing this name, which we will use as the title for the event, and we thought that it's okay to use this sequel element, so from bad to worse part 2, because we are also in the season of festivity when we spend a lot of time watching movies and sequels. But yeah, so I would like to ask you to tell us a bit about this sequel, because this research is a continuation of the research which you had conducted in 2020, and the results of which were disseminated under the title "Now is only more visible: Life and Work of Cultural Workers in the Times of the Corona Pandemic." So the research in 2020 came up as a close follow-up of the pandemic. So my first question, which serves as a bit of an introduction to this conversation, is I want to ask you, can you briefly tell me what has motivated or intrigued you in 2020 and in 2022, or in the other words, what was your research question back then and now?
Hello, Maria, and hello, everyone who's watching us at the moment. Well, I think the start of the pandemic has been a really a moment that surprised us all in a way. And what followed in the next month or two has been really kind of shaking of a lot of our ways of doing things, usually a lot of normalized ways in which we were used to do, I don't know, teaching, arts, cultural production, and every other area of society. And I think as a group of researchers, there's really few opportunities in one's life where there's such a kind of global rupture going on at the moment. I think for us, it was very visible that, okay, this is the moment when kind of our colleagues from the independent cultural scene, our colleagues more broadly from the cultural scene, are actually going through some kind of quite rough challenges, we would say. And we wanted to see what's actually going on there. Like, did the pandemic made some things related to the position of cultural workers, and especially those in the independent cultural scene, more visible, which was our thesis. And those positions are the ones that we usually discuss, like very precarious working conditions, very unstable ways of practicing culture, no systemic state support. So all of those different issues that were already kind of discussed in the cultural field, we wanted to see, okay, what did a pandemic do for them, to them? And then we also wanted to check, okay, what are maybe some of the kind of positive and negative outcomes that the kind of pandemic has brought in the first 2 or 3 months, which was those moments when we really were all struck by the pandemic. And that's when we did questionnaire, kind of very detailed one with 44 items, questioning many different issues, mostly economic ones and the ones related to class and social status of the cultural workers, but then also the ones related to their kind of means of production and projects that were canceled or kept going, ways of coping with the pandemic, whether there have been any strategies of support for them, and so on and so forth. And that has been distributed across the region. There were more than 500 respondents. So in a way, we could say back then, okay, we had quite a kind of substantial view of what was going on at the moment. Already then, we were dreaming of doing a more kind of in-depth research, because what you get from the questionnaires is really, yeah, just a snapshot of certain things, and you can do a good quantitative analysis, but then in order to dig deeper into ways of thinking, specific positions in which people were in, specific strategies and tactics of coping with the effects of the pandemic, we really needed to do the interviews, and that's when the chance kind of appeared together with Kooperativa.
Okay, so you have already tackled a bit of my second question, because I was really intrigued to know, like, why did you choose different methodology in this second round? But now, when you were also giving the first response, I also realized one thing, that in time of pandemic, actually sending a longer questionnaire wasn't that such a huge issue, because I guess that all of us had time being locked down in our homes. We could fill in longer questionnaires, and after 2 years things had changed a bit, and so your methodology as well. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about the methodology and the whole process of how the research was conducted.
Yeah, well, hello everyone from my side as well. It's nice to talk about this research, because it's also, as Vishna said, a very challenging and interesting moment for all of us, for reflection and for trying to understand what is happening. And we often say that these ruptures tell us a lot also about what happened before and what happens after that. So it's a bit like when you shake the box, then you see what is inside. So in that sense, for us, the first research in 2020 was really very inspiring and very intriguing. At the end of that questionnaire, we also had two open-ended questions. One is like discussing more like a positive sides of pandemic, and the other was about negative sides. And we were quite, as I said, surprised by the answers, because we saw that quantitative data often, or in many cases, cannot fully explain what was happening to people, because we, for example, saw that people lost their earnings, but then they said they really felt good about that. And that's weird, of course. Now, it's not that weird if we know that people working in the arts and cultural field in this region have been under so much pressure last years. I mean, for decades, but including last year. So there was a lot of burnout. There was a lot of desires for being with more with family, for being more in the nature, for walking and so on. So in the first month or two, maybe people lost a bit of their earning, but they were like, okay, but at least I had time with my kids. I could, read that book that I wanted to read for years and so on. So there were some positive sides. On the other hand, it was also maybe some people didn't lose their earnings because they had some more stable earnings, but they were, for example, very frustrated with not being able to, for example, practice their art, like ballet dancers, opera singers, and other people whose everyday use of their body for their profession is crucial. So this is when we saw that things are actually quite complicated, and we'll be talking more about that. It really opens many questions for policymakers, for cultural producers, and so on. But this is precisely, going back to your question, Maria, why we wanted to devote more time to talk with people, and interviews, of course, methods to go to be able to understand these nuances and these maybe surprising things, and to also be able to maybe do a research in the future, which could be again more quantitative, but to be able to really understand what were the key things that shape people's lives in this period. But then, of course, and we'll talk more about that, but just to again just touch upon that, we didn't have a completely same sample, so we didn't speak with the same people, just same population, and that again changed things. So this is really quite a challenging field of research, actually, and it is always like that when we are trying to follow something that is actually ongoing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, this is all. I mean, this triggers the next question, which kind of goes more to the results, because I'm wondering, since we have been facing pandemic for 3 years now, and can you tell us, according to your results, but in general, how the life and creativity of the cultural workers has changed since the beginning of the pandemics in the societies of Southeast Europe? I mean, also, like, what are the major trends which you managed to identify? You mentioned some, and also I was very surprised how you mentioned the positive sides. So yes, I'm wondering what aspects of life were, according to your research, affected most, and yes, what has surprised you most in your research?
Yeah, I think I would say there's these trends that have been going on for quite some time already, and we kind of do think of cultural workers, specifically independent cultural workers, as those sort of I don't know, poster children of kind of this new neoliberal capitalism. As much as we don't want to be put in that position, that is the kind of precarity and flexibility and resilience and kind of creativity that this kind of contemporary capitalist logic is trying to project also to other workers. But then kind of cultural workers are really good at it already, in a way. And this trend of further precarization has been actually quite visible, both in terms of lost earnings, unstable earnings, the need to do few jobs at the same time, or to kind of balance and have numerous professions, not just one that is kind of dearest to your heart. Then there's this aspect of people talking about their own precarization.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something also really relevant, that this is not something that is kind of a research concept being put on a certain population of people, but it's actually kind of independent cultural scene is recognizing this position, they're kind of debating it and so on. In many respects, also in terms of kind of their precarity before the COVID has meant that they have been more prepared for the COVID than someone else. But there's also this very strange kind of, or maybe expected trend in which you kind of internalize this crisis and flexibility and kind of strategies of coping with all the different dangers that come along. And then once the kind of pandemic starts, you're like, yeah, I'm ready for this because I've been preparing for this for the last several years. So definitely kind of precarization as one. Another one closely connected to that is this sort of reassessment of hyperproductivity and self-exploitation that is going on in the sector. Because for many COVID has brought this sort of, the world has stopped, or there was time to pause, or there was time to do nothing. There was time to do things that are not kind of production oriented and activity oriented, but that are more related to research, documenting your previous work, maybe doing an album that you didn't think you would be doing. So all those sorts of things, like I can't do the thing that I get money for, but then I can do so many other things. And at the same time, this noticing that many people say they don't want to go back to the kind of productivist logic they were in before the COVID. And now that's also something to discuss, who can do that, who can't do that, and we can leave that for later. And then there's this trend of domestication of work, basically working from home, and what does that mean? And this trend has been going on in the independent cultural scene for quite a while, kind of carrying your computer with you wherever you go, and especially kind of working from home, maybe not having an office or a place where to practice. And that has also kind of, that trend has been exacerbated by the COVID. It also had very different consequences on people with kids or with the elderly in their family who weren't able to kind of work from home, or on those who maybe had to go every day to a certain job and now could actually do their creative work from home. It also had different repercussions for different sectors, and we can maybe talk about that later as well. Then I would say a big trend that was kind of counter what was going on before the COVID. So all of those that I have mentioned are already something that has been going on before the COVID, but COVID had made it kind of worse or more visible. While, for example, this inability to travel and kind of the need to localize your work and really contextualize it within the immediate kind of neighborhood or the city because you couldn't move during the lockdowns, that's something very new. And that's something that kind of a lot of respondents in the interviews reflect upon. Maybe we can talk also about differences between 2020, 2022, because things have changed as well. And I would say that as much as people appreciated this kind of localized work in the first few months of the pandemic, not being able to travel for 3 years, or being able but then not, has not been received as something positive. That is definitely the kind of probably biggest lack that people in the sector feel. There's been this kind of digitization of culture really pushed to the extreme. I think we were all noticing that. That's been a big change, a big shift from the usual ways of working. And strategies have been different of coping with that. Some people really embraced it, mostly those that were already in some way experimenting with it. So for them, it was like a breakthrough moment. For some, it has been something that is not welcomed, especially in the kind of performing arts scene. There's a lot of reflection on kind of, we have to be there with our bodies, with the audience. It doesn't make sense for that to be digital. But then there's also recognition that all the meetings, live streaming, and all the other things kind of making culture more accessible is actually the benefit of this kind of digital shift that has happened. The kind of this question of who's the audience, how we search for it when there's a lockdown or where people are not anymore trusting each other and trusting the public space, that's a big question for the cultural sector. And we felt that actually the smaller the organization, but also the one that has its own space, the better they were in actually having some sort of continuity. So yeah, maybe I would stop here and then we can expand on some of those things.
Yeah, you have opened so many interesting fields for discussions. And I don't know, first I would just like to focus this conversation a bit more on this distinction between 2020 and 22. If you could just tell us a bit more about that, and then we can also dig a bit deeper into some of those really interesting fields of research which you have actually mapped here now. But yeah, can you just tell us, like, in your impression, or after your analysis, what has changed most for the cultural workers since 2020 and the beginning of pandemic, and 2022, where we are still facing the pandemic, but the context has changed a bit?
Yeah, well, you said well, our opinions versus data, because we have to be cautious a bit with data, because we didn't have exactly the same people 2020 and 2022, so things a bit change. But our also people in 2022, with their interviews, they reflected back on, so we can construct some kind of narrative what happened. And in a possible narrative which I think could be shared is that basically March 2020 we had a big rupture. Everything stopped. People felt this like huge, they also were afraid for themselves, for others. We were all engulfed, like soaked in this global apocalypse, and that, especially for people from arts and culture who are anyway prone to think about society, to think about world, to think about meanings and values and so on, it feels that it was a big like calling for them for reflection, like what is happening, what am I doing in my life, what is art, what is culture, what is public institution, what is public space, all these big questions that we are anyway tangentially like rubbing upon in our work, they became like really central. Or like what is the life and work balance, and so on and so forth. And it feels that people had like dramatically different answers to these questions, and also actions that they did. But if we would try to look for a single thing that most of them shared, I would say it is some kind of moment, okay, let's do what I feel like is important, or what should be done. So it was this moment like, okay, now I don't do what I'm used to do, but I reflected upon it, I thought about it, and I'll do the right thing. And then the right thing really differs. Someone opened like a new Instagram whatever profile and uploaded bunch of things. Someone uploaded videos to be shared for free. Someone went into the local neighborhood and did something with Roma kids. Someone just slept and did nothing because they think this is really important. Someone spent more time with kids, as I said. Someone learned a new skill or a language, or so it's quite different. But I would say all of these are actually quite related to some kind of ideological position of these people, and to some kind of core values that they think about. And no matter how horrible the situation was, we heard both in 2020 and 2022 about these early months that they were these very significant moments. People from Bosnia, for example, in many cases compared it to the war experiences, and to, for example, Sarajevo siege and events like that. Those are these life-changing moments which like bring us back to our communities, to our core values, to things that we really feel and want to do. And with that, I would say, come some kind of weird optimism, or weird, maybe optimism is not the best word, but some kind of feeling that you are in the right place, and that some kind of positive or desired or needed change can happen. So there was some kind of new energy with things. And that was gone. So basically, as the pandemic lasted, as the lockdowns lasted, as we saw political elites completely unable to, run it and manage it and support people, and as we saw also these like national borders again being more important in the time when they should be less important, and when we saw the failures of our medical systems and our schools and everything, so everything came crumbling down. Plus, it's nice to, and I mean, it's okay to live with less money for a month or two, but then when it's 20 months, then reading a lot of books is not fun anymore. So for a lot of people, it meant like, okay, this is not fun anymore. We are really struggling and we are really in trouble. So a lot of these experiments that tried to kind of open up for a more virtuous world failed, and that brought a lot of frustration on the one hand. So it was like a game over. Then also, it's also not so black. A lot of people who have experimented with some things, like, okay, I wanted to do more things with local audiences. I wanted to do more things online. I wanted to collaborate with a friend from other country that I couldn't for years and stuff. Some of these experiments worked well, and a lot of actors found new avenues, new audiences, new methods, new approaches, new ways, and so on. And that also brought some inspiration, experiences, learning, and so on. But looking at it from distance, and I would also say looking at it from the culture policy view, it felt that there was a moment for reflection. There was a moment to deal with these really important questions, and then that moment was gone, and that brought quite a bit of frustration. So it's and we'll discuss more about that, but it's a big question, like in the future times like this, should we completely prevent shocks, or do shocks also bring moments of reflection? Then also, should we actually wait for shocks to be able to reflect? So I would say this continuity versus rupture is something that is going throughout research, and it feels that in some kind of future of culture and artistic profession, there should be place both for continuity and change, but if they could go in some kind of parallel way.
Yeah, I would maybe add a few more things that come to my mind. I think the big question was the question of systems of support and care. Like, who is caring for cultural workers? Who's caring for independent cultural scene? How do you sustain your work 2 years, 3 years into the pandemic? And that's also really changed from the beginning of the pandemic up until the end. So I would say what is more or less constant is that the state support or some sort of systemic support has been really lacking, at least to the extent in which people would have liked to see it. There was a bit more support in Croatia. There was some really cosmetic support in Serbia and Montenegro. There was no support in Bosnia whatsoever. And I think it's quite telling, especially from the interviews with Croatian independent cultural scene, what seems to be, and that is very similar to the Serbian cultural scene as well. So what the state was trying to rescue are businesses and entrepreneurs. Basically, whoever had some commercial activity linked to their cultural center or cultural space, such as cafe or shop, could get a subsidy or could get a support. Same is with the people who had their personal agencies through which they were working kind of as freelancers. So it was much better that you are an entrepreneur, that you have your own personal agency, so you could get funding from the state and support from the state. But that wasn't the case if you were doing the same work, but just through the other legal entity, being independent artist, for example, registered through the Association of Artists. And that's really telling in terms of who the states thought about, whom they wanted to rescue. There's really this idea, okay, we are rescuing those who can produce the money back, and not rescuing civil society, not rescuing independent kind of cultural workers, activists, and so on. In the middle of that, I think there were, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, there was this feeling that the sector, especially in the independent cultural scene, has organized to help itself. So there were these new forms of solidarity, such as Solidarity Fund by the independent cultural scene, the Association of Independent Cultural Scene in Serbia, and ULUS, the Association of Artists, which worked as a mechanism for a few months and has been helping some of the people, even some of the people we interviewed. But then the responses in 2022 suggest a very different picture. So basically, even that professional solidarity that could have led maybe to some sort of unionizing on a national and even regional level, advocating further, requiring certain things from the state on a long-term basis, has basically faded away a bit. And the only system of support that has been continuous is actually family and very close friends, which we also also takes us back to some of the data we have from the previous years that show that, well, if you have a support in your partner working or in your family background, so this kind of life nurturing, very close relation system, then you can practice arts in the independent cultural scene. And opens the whole issues of class and who can be the part of the cultural work and who can't, and so on. So basically in 2020, there were quite some people who commented that they are going to change the profession, that they can't sustain their work, that they are going roseberry picking because there's nothing they can rely on. We didn't have that sort of sample in 2022. So basically this year we talked with people who continued practicing culture within the independent cultural scene, which means they were able, they had enough contacts, they had enough support in one way or another. And yeah, I think that is something that is really telling how the idea of arts and culture supported through a kind of welfare state cultural policy is really fading away in the whole region. And that there has to be some both push to have that back in some manner, but also kind of push to kind of unionize and kind of make this be stronger together.
Stronger together, yeah. So now when you were mentioning the systematic distribution of the support or the lack of it, and also the different ways in which the support was distributed, and also Goran earlier implied something which is I think very important information for all of us also dealing with advocacy, but dealing with independent cultural scene in general, is this conception of it as not as being a homogenized body, because what I have heard from you and read from the preliminary results is that not everyone has been affected equally. So can you please tell us something about those interesting distinctions, as well as of different strategies of coping with crises that you have managed to identify in both researches?
Yeah, I think you're very right in saying that we can't really observe this as a homogeneous field. It's so different, related to many aspects, and I would mention just kind of some of them. Okay, so I was mentioning class issues and whether you come from a family which can sustain your work as a kind of independent cultural worker, curator, manager, and so on. So that not in terms of kind of continuously supporting you, but that you know that that is a safety net in case, in times when you don't have any earnings, in periods where you have to bridge certain things, also types of friends and contacts that you have around. And sometimes that doesn't have to be money. In some cases we had, for example, a case of a couple dealing with performing arts in the independent cultural scene. So they are both very precarious workers with kids. In the times of COVID, they have been heavily affected. What saved them is that their parents have some land somewhere in the south of Serbia where they could go and actually grow their own food and kind of sustain themselves in that way. So it's not actually the kind of financial means necessarily, but yeah, the possibility to basically cover your very basic needs. And for them, that sort of arrangement worked fine. And they are, for example, ones that were reflecting on the time before COVID as the time they wouldn't kind of repeat in terms of the amount of work and the amount of kind of struggles to find some earning. but they now see other ways of kind of sustaining themselves. Then there's this huge question of health and like whether your body is a healthy body or not. That's like, there's been an interesting interview with a contemporary dancer and choreographer from Serbia that had this term precarity 2.0, in which basically you're not only precarious because of your position and instability of funding and engagements and so on and self-exploitation, but suddenly you're precarious because you are not, your immunity is not kind of good enough. You are the one that can easily get infected. The vaccines don't function on you. So suddenly there's this kind of very big point of exclusion of those people whose health systems, kind of personal health, is not just able to cope with the pandemic. So he has been excluded from many things. Also, there has been kind of quite some support he was getting from the colleagues, but also different ways of and tactics of trying to work online, making choreographies digitally. That has become part of his work. So these topics come back in the creative process as something you address through your performances, for example. But yeah, so health issue, especially with the dancers and actors, has been a big one. Then this question whether you're male or female and whether you have family and elderly to care about or not. We see in our research, but also in other research conducted during the COVID, basically this kind of domestication of work, the need to kind of not go to work, but have kids studying not at school, but at home, and you working from there, meant for, especially for many women, that kind of you just overwork during the pandemic. So what for some has been a period of great rest, for some has been a period where kind of things were really kind of breaking on all levels. Then I would say how much internationally you are connected or you have been connected before. There's been people who had their engagements or planned to go on residencies internationally. They were still getting those funds, even though they were not doing residencies. One international engagement would substitute for few months of living within your own country. So that sort of thing did help in many occasions for many people. Those who haven't been part of such networks have suffered much more. Would also say whether you're a couple working in the same sector or not, or your partner is someone that you can rely upon financially in these tough situations, that's also another thing. And then there's a whole set of differences that come with what type of arts and culture you are practicing. Basically, it wasn't the same for visual artists or for writers who could easily kind of be at home and still create than it was for performance artists of different kinds. Musical groups and choirs that couldn't meet and couldn't even do the kind of choir online. That has been a big kind of threat. There's an interesting interview with a person who is running a kind of folk dance group in Montenegro for many different generations. He says because they were unable to meet, many kids have subscribed to sports instead, basically because after a few months of not having any sort of practice, they needed some other activity. And that also shows kind of a big disparity between how the governments treated sports, for example, and sport venues versus how they treated cultural venues and cultural centers. And then there's this question of whether you have a space or not. So those organizations and also those individuals that were working with institutions who had a space had much lesser worries, I would say. Yes, kind of sustaining the space, but the space also meant that you can do some programs, you can have a continuity of audience no matter how small. You could transform your openings of the exhibitions not into 1 hour of opening, but kind of have an opening during the whole week where people come. And in many small cities, this was actually the only cultural activity or the only activity in public space being open constantly very soon after the first lockdowns. So for them, it has been something that actually raised their profile during the pandemic. But then for those who don't have any space, it has been really a struggle of either kind of trying something online but also not being able to book any other space because things have been postponing so much that the moment the lockdowns ended, basically the institutions and cultural organizations who have spaces were doing their own programs. So there was no space for independent actor coming and doing the performance. And an interesting strategy of coping with that has been kind of reclaiming public space. So for some artists, they were saying that before the pandemic, it was sort of it felt as not good enough or not artistic enough to go and perform in the street, the type of art that they were doing. But now, because they can't book any official space and they don't want to work only online, they have been embracing just, okay, we want to perform today, we go to the city and to the streets and perform. And that created some immediate kind of relationship with the audience that has been new and beneficial for them as they reflect.
Thank you. I mean, hearing all of this, it really justifies this the approach which you had taken. So after having this after having this quantitative research with many questionnaires being filled, that you have decided to undertake this second step of providing us with like in-depth perspective. Many examples which you have given now, like is sort of a flash to this I don't know, to decide to this pretty much basic idea and impression which we had before. And I mean, I think that for future there are many topics to be researched, but I'm now interested in one particular issue, is that as you mentioned, Vishnya, many things has changed, and some things interestingly also for better. And also I'm wondering now what has remained the same, and what conclusions have we, which can we derive from those things which have remained the same? What can we learn about independent cultural sector according to this?
Yeah, well, it's a bit hard to conclude simply things which are so complex, but definitely there are many things that simply speak about this very marginal, precarious position of arts and cultural workers, and that COVID didn't change that. Definitely. So a lot of things stayed the same. This very painful love affair with our professions, in which a lot of culture professionals are in. So we both work and expect earning and professional satisfaction and so on, but we also love our work. Or people, I'm saying we because we are also not only academics and researchers, sorry for that, but there's also this very intimate relationships to our work makes us all more exploitable and like self-exploitable and so on. And this is precisely something that just is, we guess, that everyone knows, like artists will continue doing work even when not paid, and that's something that is usually exploited in a negative way by many and by society at large. So that has stayed the same. The societal treatment of arts and culture stayed the same. As Vishna said, arts and culture is definitely not a high priority, especially in times of crisis. It's more important if you have a cafe in a theater to maintain that cafe than to maintain a theater. You know? So these things haven't changed. What also didn't change is the importance of networks of care and solidarity and professional exchange and so on. And they actually just show that they're more important in the times of crisis. So what can we take from this? I mean, many things, and we really invite you to dig deeper into the report and maybe some publications that are coming, because yeah, two of us in relatively short time, we definitely can't cover everything. But one big challenge is like, okay, so how do we build these networks of care? How do we strengthen our positions? How do we go about culture policy making? Because it seems that many people working in arts and culture are much closer to people who are not working in that field than to their colleagues. Like if you're a painter, there's a high chance that you're much closer to a
commercial designer
or photographer or someone even further than a ballet dancer. And if you're a ballet dancer or opera singer or actor, you could probably be closer in terms of what is troubling you and what can help you, in that sense, closer to an athlete, to a professional athlete. So in terms of designing culture policy recommendations and measures, we might actually go a step away a bit from this kind of lump sum culture workers and try to think who is actually there and why. Because what also often happens is that some subsectors within arts and culture are more vocal or just more visible to the public, so that oftentimes some kind of state support is geared towards them. So it's like, oh, we all want to do, depending on society, like if we all appreciate museums or theaters or this and that, and there's someone left out. So we think that really this crisis shows that we need to go deeper to understand different positions and different struggles in order to design mechanisms which are not only national policy making. Today we are also, of course, probably having in the audience people working in foundations, in different NGOs, in companies and so on. So there are many various forms of support, but I would say this one size fits all approach is definitely not working. We need to go a bit deeper and understand deeply what is happening. And just to repeat once more, and then as a final sentence, yes, after the times of crisis and struggle, we need to regain some kind of normalcy and feeling that things are not, so turbulent. But we also shouldn't forget those moments in which we can reflect and open up questions like, what kind of world do we want to live in? What kind of arts and culture do we want? What kind of society do we want?
Thank you very much. And before I give this sort of a final and concluding word to Vishnya, and also I would like to thank you for, bringing this very valuable, conclusions, very valuable for all the stakeholders involved, and also for networks and for advocates. I think I encourage all of you watching this now and who will be watching to really dig into research and to take the results and to incorporate them in their future strategies. And before I give Vishnya a word, I would also like to invite you who are watching us now. If you have questions, you can post it in the Facebook chat. I will read it and share with my guests today, with my researchers. Okay, so Vishnya, maybe also a concluding word or something that you particularly feel that it was missed today in this conversation. And I guess many things were missed, but something which you would really like to emphasize a bit.
Well, I think there's one thing that is kind of seems like a technical detail. Well, a thing that we should have mentioned before and we didn't. And I would like to say it, and that's the kind of, we were doing the research in the whole region, but it seemed not only that the positions of individuals within that region were different due to all the things that I mentioned, but also the country positions are very different at the moment. And the COVID crisis and what Goran mentioned, the national borders that became important and the passports that became important, actually did put a big difference between, for example, independent cultural scene in Croatia and independent cultural scene in other countries in the region. So this inability to travel, this question of whether my passport is infected with COVID because I'm Bosnian and it's not if I'm a Croatian, that has been a big issue for kind of running throughout interviews. And I think with that in mind, there should be also some sort of solidarity being kind of envisioned between the region and among the people in the region. There's been a lot of mentioning of kind of festivals pushing for their local artists in the moments when they couldn't bring others, which was beneficial for those local ones. But then a whole kind of groups and troops from Serbia, Bosnia, and so on were kind of left out, for example, from the festivals in Croatia or in Montenegro or vice versa. So it would be interesting envisioning some sort of regional answer to the next crisis when it appears, and the possibility to do exchanges, at least within the region. But I think kind of if I zoom out completely and kind of remember what were the really most inspiring moments, but also kind of emotions that I was left with, kind of reading the interviews and doing the research, it would be this feeling that kind of there's such a love and dedication and motivation among all the people that are doing this sort of work, that are seeing themselves as cultural professionals, as people in the independent cultural scene. And that sort of reflection towards their profession and status, kind of just parts of it is really about how much we'll earn, what connections we have, what sort of relation do we build with a society. But there is this kind of internal motor, which I feel for many was also helping them to stay well psychologically, because they could be dealing with this creative work that they are doing. And there's, I would say, so much love, so much quotes, so much inspiration that people find in their jobs, in their profession. That's been really amazing. And there's no really a space in the report to put that, but it's been really inspiring.
Wow, thank you very much for this ending, and very inspiring ending, and the change of discourse, which actually from bad to worse actually changed to something positive, and something at least gave us a hope for a future. And I would really like to thank both of you for joining us today, and for your engagement in this research. Also, Peja Cvetičanin, who was a part of it as well, and the members of Kooperativa's office who were engaged. And I would like to thank you who were watching us and who will be watching us, and wish you all the best in the new year. And that's it from my side.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you for watching us, being here with us.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.